Next, Republican Senator Hank Brown of Colorado takes a quiz designed by consumer advocate Ralph Nader on the GATT trade agreement. In this half-hour program, Senator Brown also discusses his position on the proposed trade pact.
Good morning. I'm Ralph Nader. With me is Richard N. Goodwin, the quiz master for this morning's exercise. This week, the Congress will vote on the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which establishes a World Trade Organization. And the vote in the House and the Senate will be on the question whether the United States should become a member of this World Trade Organization, which is expected to have about 124 nations as members. The core agreement that is being deliberated is right over there of the Uruguay round. The House is expected to vote first, and reserving a mere 4 hours for the debate on this momentous matter, and then the Senate will vote probably on Thursday, December 1st. Before the Congress closed down for business prior to the election, we sent letters to every member of Congress asking them to demonstrate that they have read this core agreement by signing an affidavit and to publicly answer 10 simple questions about its content. The genesis of this letter was a widespread observation which we had acquired in meetings with members of the House and Senate that very, very few of these legislators had concentrated or focused at all on the contents of this World Trade Agreement and its impact on American workers, on the marketplace, on the environment, and perhaps above all, on the democratic processes that our country has been accustomed to pursuing. Time and time again, members of the House and Senate and their staff would tell us that they haven't had time to focus on it, and they don't know what's really in it. And so we thought this invitation, this challenge to every member would stimulate and focus their concentration so that they knew more about the contents and were able to vote in an informed manner. The challenge was open for 2 weeks, and on the last day we received a call from the office of Senator Hank Brown, Republican of Colorado, and he accepted the challenge to answer 10 questions in public about the contents of the GATT agreement. Senator Brown served in the House of Representatives before he was elected to the Senate and has made a reputation of being a moderate conservative, one who has strong views on fiscal responsibility, but also who has displayed environmental and other concerns. He is here today to answer the questions. This is a rather unaccustomed position for a senator to be in. Usually he's sitting up here and we're sitting down there. But it also reflects an exceptional willingness to expose his knowledge in the public light about this GATT agreement and to convey the need for other members of Congress to similarly study this agreement before the vote in this lame duck session this week. And we're very pleased to have Senator Brown here, and certainly his acceptance of this challenge is wholly commendable, and I would say exemplary. The quiz master is Richard N. Goodwin. He was the House investigator in the late 1950s of the quiz scandals, a subject which is the topic of a current movie playing all over the country entitled Quiz Show. After that, he became special assistant to President Kennedy and President Johnson in the White House. He's the architect of the Alliance for Progress and was a very important intermediary with world figures during those two administrations. Since then, he has written a number of books, the most recently being titled Promises to Keep, an analysis of where the American dream is in our country at the present time. The procedure will be that Mr. Goodwin will ask Senator Brown the questions. If Senator Brown wants the question repeated, by all means, that will be done. Some of these questions have a bit of complexity to them. But in our invitation, we emphasize that these would be 10 simple questions by comparison with the enormous mass of complexity that is reflected in those volumes. And after each question, Senator Brown will give his answer, and Mr. Goodwin will duly record whether it was accurate or not. There will be 12 questions asked, and if Senator Brown answers 10 correctly, we will assume that he has successfully met the challenge, one might say with flying colors. Mr. Goodwin.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, Senator, and I'm glad to be here, Ralph. The Senator is clearly the most courageous member of the United States Congress, being the only, or the most foolish, or the most foolish. No, I wouldn't describe it as that. I think it can't be pure coincidence that it's been 40 years since the Republicans controlled the Congress, and it's been 40 years since Ralph Nader sat in the chairman's chair. So there has to be some relationship. But I'm glad to have you here, Senator, and I have the questions right here in this sealed envelope, which of course has been kept in Mr. Nader's office. I did notice that the wording of the questions may display a slight bit of the bias, perhaps, of Mr. Nader's the weight of Mr. Nader's own conviction, but on balance, I think they're pretty fair and objective, and we feel free to quarrel with any of the answers that are given here. So we shall begin. All right, this is a multiple choice question. They're always the simplest. Which political body shall determine the annual share of the World Trade Organization's operating expenses owed by the United States? A, the House Ways and Means Committee, B, the Senate Finance Committee, C, the Office of Management and Budget, D, the General Counsel of the World Trade Organization, or other.
That decision ultimately is made by D, the General Counsel.
That's correct. The General Counsel of the World Trade Organization makes the decision. All right. The World Trade Pact, now before Congress, is to be administered by a new international body, the World Trade Organization, that will be located in Geneva, Switzerland. The United States will have one vote in the World Trade Organization. Will the United States also have a veto, a weighted vote as it does at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, or none of the above?
It has neither the veto it has in the UN nor the weighted vote that it has in the International Monetary Fund. The answer is none of the above.
That is correct again. That's 2 in a row. Under the World Trade Organization, tribunals comprised of 3 trade experts drawn from a roster of practicing trade lawyers, scholars, and trade officials would hear challenges against countries' laws as violating the World Trade Organization rules. Once these panelists have ruled, their decisions are enforceable through trade sanctions. Considering the sizable influence these panelists will have on each World Trade Organization member nation's domestic laws, what are the World Trade Organization's conflict of interest provisions to ensure there are not economic or other conflicts?
I think one of the major concerns I ran across as I went through it is the absence of conflict of interest provisions. The agreement does provide that citizens who are from countries that are parties to the dispute may not serve on those panels unless there's unanimous agreement to allow them But other than barring people who are either direct parties or third parties involvees in the disputes, there are no conflict of interest provisions.
Well, that is absolutely accurate. There are no conflict of interest provisions, with the exception of the qualification that the Senator noted. All right, number 4. The United States court system provides for certain due process protections. For instance, all court documents are available to the public and press, as are hearings on cases. The procedural rules of the World Trade Organization prompted 50 newspaper publishers and heads of journalistic societies to write a protest letter to President Clinton in September 1994. When a U.S. law is challenged at the World Trade Organization, which of the following groups from the United States have the right to attend the deliberations or obtain the documents of the Dispute Settlement Board? A, the U.S. media, B, the U.S. public, C, the affected U.S. companies, D, the affected U.S. workers, E, state attorneys general, or F, none of the above.
My sense is, in looking at the dispute settlement body panels, is that they do not embody what we would think of as even minimal due process rights. In terms of sitting in on the deliberations are closed, so none of the parties that you mentioned can sit in on them. The decisions are anonymous, that is, you don't know how people voted. And in terms of obtaining the documents, you would have to go through one of the parties and obtain their permission. So in terms of an absolute right to look at the documents, no one has those unless they go through the parties themselves. And
so who is protected? Well, is anybody protected? Or there's no due process requirement at all? That's not a question. I was just...
Well, the protection, obviously there's an appellate process. If you appeal that decision, the decisions, first of all, are final within 60 days and automatically approved by the dispute settlement body unless they're appealed. If they're appealed, there's a panel of 7, of which 3 are selected to hear the appeal, and that is automatically accepted unless the dispute settlement body approves unanimously by consensus to not register the decision. But the fact is there simply aren't the basic safeguards in the system.
And it has to be unanimous rejection then.
Yes, consensus.
Well, you've answered the next question as well in answering that one. So that's 5, but that's correct. That was correct. They were both correct. 4 and 5. Which is 5 was the final decisions of the World Trade Organization's dispute tribunals take effect automatically. And thus, what percentage of the World Trade Organization nations that are members reject the finding?
100%.
He said unanimous, and unanimous is what it is. All right, number 6, the United States has long used access to its market to enforce a variety of human rights, national security, environmental, and health laws. For instance, we have banned imports from countries that violate human rights or products that are not safe. As well, under trade laws, such as one called Section 301, we prohibit a country from sending goods to our markets on favorable terms if it does not open its market to our goods. Under the World Trade Organization, could the U.S. continue to use these unilateral trade measures against World Trade Organization members?
Under the World Trade Organization, Section 301 stays on the books. It's still U.S. law. This act does not repeal it. And others stay on the books, or at least some of the others stay on the books. But under the World Trade Agreement, we agree to the dispute settlement body process and would waive our ability to act. Section 301 would still have validity for countries that are not signatories to the GATT agreement or the World Trade Organization agreement, and it would have an application where someone has not signed one of the underlying agreements, and the question deals solely with those. But other than those areas, we have surrendered our ability to take action to the dispute settlement body.
We have surrendered our ability to enforce the security, environmental, and health laws then with trade.
Exactly. And as a matter of fact, the World Trade Organization agreement does not really include protections for the environment, safety, and so on. There is discussion of environmental questions in the preamble to the WTO, but there are not effective provisions that deal with human rights or environment or other questions included in it.
Well, that's absolutely right. Thank you, Senator. Would the World Trade Organization require the United States to accept imported food that does not conform to our existing standards?
Yes, under some circumstances, it can require the U.S. to accept imported food that is produced or comes from a country that has standards that are different from ours. For that to be the case, the exporting country has to demonstrate that the standards they have used provide the appropriate level of sanitary and phytosanitary protection that is required in this country. And an example might well be grain produced in Mexico, where they allow the use of DDT. DDT is not allowed to be used in the United States, but if Mexico could show that the grain that comes into the United States does not have any residue or detectable residue, they might well be able to get that in effect, use DDT when we prohibit it in this country.
Yeah. Well, I think that's accurate. All that is required is that they have equivalent standards of the nature that you said, and of course there is no specific definition of the word equivalent, and it is the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which you quoted. So I'll have to mark that one correct also, Ralph. All right. Under the World Trade Organization on technical barriers to trade, all World Trade Organization members are required to base their domestic standards on international standards that are now complete or whose completion is imminent. Technical standards refer to any non-food product standard, such as consumer product safety standards, bans on hazardous substances such as asbestos, and environmental laws such as the Clean Air Act. The World Trade Organization would allow countries to avoid the requirement of international standards for only 3 reasons. That the international standard does not provide sufficient consumer health or safety or environmental protection is not one of these reasons or exceptions. Please name the 3 reasons, that which a country can avoid the requirement of international standards.
You may avoid the international standards, or you can have different standards, higher standards, if you can show that the measures do not meet, that the measures are inappropriate or ineffective in terms of meeting fulfilling legitimate goals. The examples of 3 areas would include geography, climate, and technology.
That is absolutely right. The 3 reasons for being able to avoid standards are fundamental technological problems, fundamental climatic problems, or fundamental geographic problems. That's from the Agreement on Technical Barriers of Trade, Article 2. Under the current GATT, if a dispute panel rules against a U.S. federal or state law, The decision of the panel and any later decision to impose sanctions could only be made if the United States agreed. Under the proposed World Trade Organization, the de facto veto has been eliminated. Thus, should the World Trade Organization rule against a U.S. law, the United States would have only 3 options in response. What are those 3 options?
First one would be to change the laws, rules, regulations, procedures to conform with the finding of the dispute settlement body panel. The second would be to pay compensation, as they might determine, to atone for that variance. The third would be to suffer sanctions as imposed by the body, which could involve loss of trade access or privileges, or sanctions as recommended by the opposing party.
Well, those are the 3 possible responses, Senator, and that question is also correct. Number 10, the Clinton administration has stated that the United States would have no obligation under the World Trade Organization to make U.S. laws meet World Trade Organization regulations. If the United States joins the World Trade Organization, would it have the legal obligation to conform its law with the hundreds of pages of Uruguay round rules?
Well, the agreement makes it clear that we do have that obligation to change the laws, and that requirement applies not only to federal statutes but to state statutes, rules, and procedures as well. There are some exceptions where you can, as we've discussed priorly, that you can prove that those standards are inappropriate or ineffective to meet legitimate objectives. But yes, they are required to conform our laws.
That is right. The Article 16 states members shall ensure conformity of their laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with all of with this agreement here.
He's already met the grounds of the test. Anything further to
This is very, very impressive. I wanted to assure you that these questions were absolutely secret before this. There. Shall we do the last 2 questions? Yes. The North American Free Trade Agreement clearly exempted actions to be taken under 3 major environmental treaties: the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Waste and Their Disposal, the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, and the United Nations Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Which of these environmental treaties are exempted under GATT, World Trade Organization?
I don't believe any of them are exempted under
No, that is true. None of them are exempt according to Article 16 of the treaty. Is it true or false that a ban by any World Trade Organization member nation on the trade of goods produced by prison labor and by child labor are illegal under GATT?
No, I don't believe that that's clear at all, and it's one of the major concerns and questions.
And you said false, and that's is again accurate. That's 12 out of 12. Let me ask you one other question, Senator. How many of your colleagues are as well acquainted with this treaty as you are? Would you guess?
Well, most of them weren't foolish enough to spend the last month reading the thing.
Well, I want to congratulate the Senator on a wonderful performance, and I think we ought to give him a round of applause. Very, very, very impressive. At least Colorado is well represented in the United States Congress.
Let me thank you and Mr. Nader. Without your challenge, I'm not sure I would have spent as much time as I have in this. I started this off thinking it would be a little less challenging than it's been to go through it because the number of pages is not that large. What I found, of course, was that the agreements incorporate a large number of other documents, rules, and measures, so that what's involved is not 500 or 600 pages. What's involved is, by inclusion by reference, more than 22,000 pages. Obviously, I didn't read all of those, but I did find it much more of a challenge than I argued for.
And you met it.
Senator, certainly we want to thank you for doing this, and we hope that other members in the short time available will look into these issues so that they can make an informed vote. In the past few months, have heard representatives and senators say, what is the WTO, namely the World Trade Organization, and similar questions based on a severe lack of familiarity with its contents. And so for performing in an exemplary way in answering these questions, you certainly are to be commended. These questions may sound simple in their answers, as Senator Brown scored so well, but very few members of Congress would have come even close in terms of the score that he just registered this morning. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you. I might say, if I could, in one last observation, I started this process inclined to vote for GATT. I'm a strong advocate and a believer in free trade. I've advocated not only NAFTA and voted for NAFTA, but advocated a broad expanse of new free trade agreements that includes everything from arrangement with Chile to working with Central Europe, European powers, and others. I had every expectation that I would end up voting for GATT. I must say, after having gone through it, though, my mind has been changed. What I found is an agreement that establishes a court system, an international court system, but unfortunately without the basic provisions of due process. It sets up a new form of world government, albeit quite limited, dealing with trade matters only, but it sets it up without providing fair representation. The U.S. Takes about 30% of the world's exports. We'll pay 25 to 30% of the cost, and we'll have only one vote out of 124. What's more, I think there is an enormous potential for a huge bureaucracy to be developed here, and I refer not just to the $11 billion cost that's associated with this. That is the increase in the deficit that the Congressional Budget Office says will take place. But this forms 50 new committees, organizations, bodies, all of which will have the potential of being extremely expensive. And what we do with this is create, in effect, an international bureaucracy of unprecedented size. And I know the estimates are low now, but one should not overlook what happens with the International Monetary Fund, where the average salary has reached $176,000, much of it tax-free. And the reason that happens is because the countries that pay the bills are not the same ones that control the organization. I think you can't look at the WTO and not come to the conclusion that that more than 90 votes will be by third world countries that pay almost none of the cost. And you literally have set up a circumstance where people who pay almost none of the cost will decide who gets the jobs and how much they pay. And I want to thank you for offering this challenge, because without it I would not have perhaps devoted the last number of weeks to it.
One final announcement, thank you very much, Senator, is today we have released the list of over 60 pending bills in the Senate, sponsored by a variety of senators, which we think would be declared WTO illegal.